About halfway between New York and West Egg, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile or so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, grotesque gardens, or a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track and comes to rest, gives out a ghastly creak and comes to rest, and immediately ash-gray men, distracted by the cat, and immediately ash-gray men with leaden spades, ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operation from your sight. But above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust that drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high, and they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist had set them there in order to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let the barges through, passengers in the waiting train can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There is always a halt here of at least a minute, and it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. Acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular cafes with her and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about, chatting with whomsoever he pleased. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. I was taking the train... this part. One afternoon, going to New York with Tom on the train. We stopped by the ash heap. He, taking hold of my elbow, literally forced me from the car. One afternoon, going to New York with Tom on the train. Tempted to actually look it up. One afternoon, going up to New York with Tom on the train, as we stopped by the ash heaps, he leapt to his feet. He, taking hold of my elbow, leapt to his feet and literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he'd tanked up a good deal at luncheon in his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was, on a Sunday afternoon, I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low whitewashed railroad fence and back along the road 100 yards or so under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. Just along the road 100 yards or so under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only buildings in sight was a small block of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the 3 shops it contained was for rent, another was an all-night diner approached by a trail of ashes. And the third was a garage, repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car in sight was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford that crouched in a dim corner. It occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead when the proprietor himself appeared in the doorway of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old man," said Tom, jovially slapping him on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," said Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. I've got my man working on it now." "Worked pretty slow, don't he?" "No," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I better sell it somewhere else after all." "I didn't mean that," said Wilson hurriedly. "I just meant that..." His voice trailed off. "I just meant that..." Tom glanced impatiently around the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and the thickish figure of a woman appeared in the light of the office door. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above spotted dress of dark blue crepe de chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if all the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly and, walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. She wet her lips, and in a low, coarse voice, spoke to her husband without turning around. And without turning around, spoke to her husband in a low, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down." "Oh, sure," said Wilson, and immediately hurried, as he hurried off in the direction of the office door, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his pale suit and his dark hair as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except for his wife, who moved closer to Tom. "I want to see you," he said. "Get on the next train." "All right. We'll meet you by the drug stand on the lower... meet you by the newsstand on the lower level." She nodded and moved away from Tom just as George Wilson emerged from the office door with 2 chairs. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was nearing the 4th of July. It was near the 4th of July? It was nearing the 4th of July. And we watched a scrawny gray Italian child setting torpedoes along the road. "Awful place, isn't it?" said Tom. "Terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "It does her good to get away." "Awful place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "Awful. It does her good to get away." "Doesn't her husband object?" "Wilson, he thinks she goes to visit her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive." And so Tom Buchanan, his girl, and I took the train together up to New York. Or not quite together, as Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibility of those East Eggers that may have been on the train. She had changed her dress into a brown-figured muslin, which stretched tight over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her down to the platform in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and a moving pictures magazine. At the drugstore, she bought a small flask of she bought some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. In the solemn echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before selecting a new one, lavender in color with a gray interior. And in this, we slid out from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately she turned sharply from the window, and tapped on the front glass. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said, earnestly. "They're a nice thing to have. I want one for the apartment. They're a nice thing to have, a dog." We backed up to a gray old man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. In a basket swung from his neck cowered a dozen or so very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" asked Mrs. Wilson eagerly. "All kinds. What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs," she said. "I don't suppose you got that kind." The man peered doubtfully into his basket, plunged in a hand, and drew one up wriggling by the back of the neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. "It's not exactly it's not a police dog exactly," said the man with doubt in his voice. "It's more of an Airedale. Look at that coat." He ran a hand over the brown wash rag of a back. "Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching cold." "I think it's cute," said Mrs. Wilson enthusiastically. "How much is it?" That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale, certainly there was some Airedale mixed up in it somewhere, although its paws were shockingly white, changed hands and settled down in Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she asked delicately. "That dog? That's a boy," said the man. "It's a bitch," said Tom. "Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it." We drove on over the park towards 158th Street, warm and soft, almost pastoral on a summer Sunday afternoon. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn around the corner. "Hold on," I said. "I've got to leave you here." "No, you don't," interposed Tom quickly. "Besides, Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment." Come on," said Mrs. Wilson. I'll call up my sister Catherine, who's said to be quite beautiful by people who ought to know." We cut back over the park towards the West Hundreds and pulled up to one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. That's right. Throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson gathered up the dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. "I'm going to have the McKees come up," she announced as we rose in the elevator. "And of course I've got to call my sister, too." The apartment was on the top floor. A small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. And a kitchen? Fuck. And a bath. And a bath. The living room was crowded to the door with tapestried furniture, much too large for it, so to move about was to stumble continually over visions of women swinging in the gardens of Versailles. There was one picture on the wall which appeared to be a hen sitting on a rock. Looked at from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet, and the countenance of a stern old lady beamed down into the room. An elevator boy was dispatched for a box of hay and some milk, to which of his own initiative he added a box of hard dog biscuits, a tin of hard dog biscuits, one of which sat decomposing apathetically in the saucer all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from behind a locked bureau door. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened had has a dim, hazy cast over it, though until 6 o'clock the apartment was full of bright sunshine. Oh, I forgot the fucking books again. There's a coffee table somewhere with some Broadway scandal sheets and a copy of Simon Called Peter on it. First, there were no cigarettes, so I went to go buy some from the corner drugstore. When I returned, Tom and Miss Wilson had disappeared, so I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff or the whiskey had distorted things because it made no sense to me. Just as Tom and Myrtle, after our first drink we called each other by our first names, reappeared, company commenced arriving at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30 with a solid sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. The eyebrows had been plucked and drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature towards the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. There was an incessant click as she moved about. There was an incessant clicking from innumerable pottery bracelets. Ah, damn it. When she moved about, there was an incessant clicking from innumerable pottery bracelets which jangled up and down her arms. She came in so hastily and looked at the furniture with such proprietary haste that I wondered if she lived there. When I asked this, she laughed immoderately, repeated the question aloud, and told me that she lived in an hotel with a girlfriend. Mr. McKee was a slender, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, and there was a spot of white lather on his cheekbones, and he was most respectful in his greetings to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer, and it was he who had taken the over-enlarged photograph of Mrs. Wilson's mother that hung on the wall like an ectoplasm. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She said with pride that her husband had photographed her 127 times since they'd been married. Mrs. Wilson had changed her dress again, and with a change of costume came a change of attitude. Gone was the impressive vitality from the garage, and in its place, and had been replaced with an impressive hauteur. She moved more. Her gestures grew bigger, and as she grew bigger, the apartment seemed to grow smaller until she was revolving on a noisy, creaking pivot through the smoky air. "These fellas will cheat you every time," she said to her sister. "I had a woman up here to look at my feet, and when I got the bill, you'd think she'd had my appendicitis out. What was her name? Mrs. Eberhard. She looks at people's feet in their homes." "I love you in that dress," said Mrs. McKee. Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment with a raised eyebrow. "This crazy old thing, it's just something I slip on when I don't care what I look like." "I think it's cute," said Mrs. McKee. "If Chester could get you in that pose, I think he could really make something of it." We all looked at her in silence. We all looked at Mrs. Wilson in silence. She moved a stray hair from her face. It's not too bad, not too good.